Now in this exercise, what we're going to be doing is installing AF. We're going to do it this way. We're going to install the AF SQL database and the AF server on two separate machines. Now we also have a couple of optional things. We're going to change some of the default configurations so that, for example, we're not using network security, we're using credentials for domain security to allow the connection between the AF server and the SQL Server database. And that's just an optional step. And then also we're going to look at installing and configuring the remote AF client. And when we do that, we're going to have to double check, make sure the SDK is properly installed and pointing to the right server. Now that one optional component I said after we do the installs is basically described like this. Let's say your IT department only allows domain users to connect to SQL Server. So by default, it's going to be connecting using network service credentials, and we're going to change that on the AF server. So we'll change the service configuration. So how are we going to do this? Well, first we're going to let's just make sure we all understand what the servers are involved. So we have this nice little diagram. So let me describe what servers are involved. First of all, the computer that's going to be hosting the actual SQL Server database itself. That SQL Server database, in this case, is a computer called AF class VM NICD. Yeah, that's just, that's the name we came up with for that particular virtual machine. Now, that's running SQL Server. It currently uses the default instance name MS SQL Server. So when we go to specify this, we can just leave the name blank and it'll go to the default. Now that's actually, in this environment, that's a virtual machine, same as what we do when we do this in a regular public class. It's a virtual machine that's actually running on my actual host machine, my desktop computer. So, and that desktop computer, by the way, is where we're going to be putting the AF server. Now that desktop machine in this instance is called NIC GX280. That's our desktop machine. That's that's the credential we're going to need, or that's the name we're going to need during the install for the AF server. We also have a Pi server involved in this. The Pi server name is actually, well, it's not a name at all. In this case, we're going to be pointing to the Pi server by IP address. It's 192.168.70.10. And that's, of course, an internal IP address. That's our Pi server. So there's three machines that are involved in here. We don't really need it in this instance much, but we are using actually the OSI domain. You're going to see that pop up from time to time as we're doing the installs. So what's it all going to look like when we're finished? Well, let's just take a look. First of all, there's going to be a virtual machine. It's this virtual machine right here called AF class NIC or VM NICD. That's actually going to be having installed on it both it's the SQL Server database that is associated with the AF database. So if we go into this SQL Server Management Studio, you'll notice that when we're finished, there's going to be a database on here called PyFD. That's the database name, the default name that we use for the AF database. So that's actually the database that contains all of the things that go into AF, this PyFD database. So that's going to be on a SQL Server machine. Also on that SQL Server machine is going to be the AF client. We're going to install that there. That's where the AF server, or the Pi AF Explorer, is going to be. And you'll also notice that when we actually point to that to the Pi server, that Pi server is actually going to be on a different machine. It's this machine over here that I'm not going to navigate over to there right now. Just want to point out that that's the Pi server that we're involving here, and we actually will be able to connect to that Pi server. So yeah, there we are. There's our connection. And I only mentioned this to just point out that there's a third server involved here. Now, let's go back to our actual host computer. If I return to my host computer, you'll see when we're finished, on that host computer, you will have this Pi AF server service. So the AF server is located on my host computer. Now, as with all of our exercises, we do ask you to try to do it first on your own, just using the approach that's described at the top. before you go to the step-by-step solution below. Okay, ready to go? Well, here we go. I'm going to be following the step-by-step instructions that are in your class manual. Now, for some of you, of course, this isn't a class exercise. You're doing this for real on your production server. So for that, we want to make sure you got all the right resources. If you haven't gotten it yet, go off to our website, our tech support website. It's techsupport.osisoft.com, and download this PyAF 2010 User's Guide, and you'll find more step-by-step instructions or more instructions on the install than what you'll find in our manual. Also, if you go there, or if you're having trouble at all, you can go ahead and give us a call at these phone numbers. That's our main tech support number you'll find right here. Here's for other languages that we support. And we're doing follow the sun kind of tech support, so of course you'll get somebody around the clock. You won't have to get anybody out of bed. So those are your resources, and let's take a look at the procedure. First thing we're going to do is we're going to start on the computer that we've got SQL Server installed on. So right now, this is my SQL Server computer. Just to make sure nobody's confused, this is a virtual machine I'm working with. So as I jump back and forth between different machines, you'll notice that, well, what I'm doing basically is using virtual machines to implement some of this to make it a little bit more convenient. And we won't get into the details of what these machines are. I'll just tell you the names of them as I switch from one to another. So this is a computer called AF Class VM NIC-D. It's a long name, but that's the name of the computer. And on this computer, I've got I need to install the PyAF server. Now I'm only going to install certain components of the AF server, and if you look at the class exercise, we'll describe what components to install. Basically, we're going to install the SQL database that is actually used to store things for AF. So on the SQL Server machine, we're going to be putting just that database. On a different machine, we're going to put the AF server itself. Now I'm going to go ahead and create a directory here called PySource. And there's no real reason why I called it PySource, no official reason. There's just kind of a tradition among tech support folks in field service that we tend to put our installations into a directory called PySource. It's just a bit of lore. And I'm copying into that PySource the installation kits for the AF client and the AF server. That's what we're going to be running in just a second. So I got this off of a network drive. You're probably going to be getting this from your download off of your tech support site. So what we have to first do is install the AF server. I'll go ahead and run this AF server installation script. And when we get to the point where we choose what to install, as I mentioned, we're not going to install everything. We're only going to install on this machine. This is the SQL Server box, the SQL Server computer. On this machine, we're only going to be running the installation that will create the SQL Server database itself. Now later on, we're going to install the AF client on this as well, but we're going to do that later on. Okay, so here's a list of the things that could be installed. The only one we're really interested in is this PyAF Server 2010, and I'll describe what components of that we're going to be installing. Okay, I'll just go ahead and acknowledge. That looks good. And here's the default installation directory. So this is where we get to choose. And what I want to disallow, or I don't want to install, is this AF application service. That's actually the AF server itself. We're going to be putting the AF server itself on a different computer. It's not running on the same machine as what is running SQL Server. Now we do want to make sure we don't touch these. We leave that as part of the install. That's actually going to create the SQL Server database. But remember, SQL Server is just being used as it's a mechanism to store those things in AF. So what we're really doing here is simply, we're not installing anything so much as creating a database in the currently installed version of SQL Server that's already on this machine. So that requires copying some scripts and then executing those scripts. So let's go ahead and do that. Now at this point, we need to specify what instance, or which SQL Server copy we're going to be installing this on. You may actually have multiple copies of SQL Server, multiple instances. The default here, as you can see during the install, is the SQL Express. We don't have the SQL Express on this machine. We have the fully licensed SQL Server 2008. And I'll give you a hint. If you simply want to go to the default instance of SQL Server, the default SQL Server on this machine, just go ahead and leave that blank. I'll go ahead and say next, and this is going to go ahead and continue with that install. Now the database that exists on SQL Server, it needs to know where the AF server is. And that is a server that is on this domain. It's my host computer, my desktop computer basically. That's on, in this case, the OSI domain, and I have a Dell GX280, so that's the name of my computer. Now this is going to be, as I said, the name of your AF server. So domain and computer name for wherever your AF server is going to be installed. It doesn't have to exist right now. It's just that as we're installing this database, the AF database itself on SQL Server needs to know where the AF server is. So I'll go ahead and choose next. I'll go ahead and acknowledge all this and go ahead and do the install. Okay, now our installation's finished. And don't worry if your installation didn't go as fast as mine. I cut in many places so you didn't have to sit here and listen to me breathe. And now our installation's done. Okay, now I've switched over to my actual local machine. And this local machine is going to serve as the AF server itself. So AF's not currently installed on here. What I'm going to go ahead and do is go to my PySource directory and install the run this AF server installation script again. Now this time we're going to take the kind of the opposite end of what we just did just earlier on the SQL Server machine. We just installed the SQL Server database. Now we're actually going to install the AF server. So I'll go ahead and run this. This is going to be on the machine that's hosting AF. So here's what's going to be installed. In this case, that's what we're really mostly interested in, but it won't affect this install. We'll go ahead and run this. So once we're past this welcome screen, we'll just put in our right user information. This is the location, and then we should get to choose the opposite set of things to install than what we chose in our previous install on the SQL Server machine. This time we are not going to install the AF database. We are going to install the AF application service. And we'll go ahead and just choose next. Now we do need to know, of course, where that SQL Server database was installed. So in this case, the name of that computer was called AF class VM NICD. And that's my SQL Server machine that I just finished installing on. This is going to validate that it can connect properly. If you wanted to, you could put in the name of the instance. If you're using SQL Server Express or whatever it is you're using. In this case, I'm going to leave that blank. By leaving it blank, it's going to connect to the default instance of SQL running on that machine. So I'll go ahead and choose next, and then wait for the verification and the installation to proceed. Okay, looks like it's verified the connection, and this is the name of my local machine. That's the AF server. This is the name of the SQL server, the remote machine. And I'll go ahead and do the install. Okay, looks like that part of the installation's gone successfully. So now we have an AF server running on this my local machine. There we go. That's what was just done. And the final step in this exercise anyway is to install the AF client. That's going to be installed back on that SQL Server machine, or it could actually be installed on any machine in this network.